Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Some are calling it class warfare, and maybe they're right on target. Our topic is the massive federal tax cuts, next on the Urban Agenda. Joining me now are David Harris, President of the Children's Research and Education Institute, and my Community Service Society colleague, David Campbell, CSS's Vice President of Programs. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. Now, I think most of the audience and viewers have heard about a $350 billion tax cut that the President got through. What is this all about? Obviously, the President has sold this as a major stimulus to help us out of the economic crisis we're in. David Campbell, what do you think?
Well, you really have to wonder, is this economic stimulus, or is this just trying to give money back to wealthy Americans? The President thinks or has argued that the tax cut will create jobs. We have to worry that if you want economic stimulus, you want money to be spent in the economy right away. The money that's being given away in the tax cut is going to wealthy Americans who are more likely to save that money than to spend it. If the President really wanted to stimulate the economy with this tax cut, the bulk of the tax cut would go to lower income Americans, New Yorkers making $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year who with a little bit of extra money could help jumpstart the economy.
But I thought this was an even-handed tax cut. Haven't they said that middle income and working people will get a big share of the benefits here?
I think the President really has been misleading about that, and that's something I think we should really be angry about. The bulk of the tax cut is going to upper income Americans. 80% of the tax cut is going to the top 10% of all income earners. 44% of the tax cut is going to people who earn over $1 million a year. So if you ask, are middle income New Yorkers, are people making $40,000 a year getting much of a tax cut? It's not true. Actually, for the median income earner, a New Yorker earning $42,000 a year, that person's likely to get at best $200 tax cut. And many, many low-income New Yorkers will get no tax cut at all.
But isn't one of the arguments that wealthy Americans, basically, who have such huge resources, will pour this money into new factories, new investment, and that's why this is a legitimate way to stimulate the economy?
I think you can worry as well that it's likely that the tax cut is a long-term tax cut. If the President really wanted the money to go into the economy right away, it would be more short-term in nature. If a person's earning $1 million and they get a $93,000 tax cut, what are they going to use it for? Some of us say, what, another yacht?
Well,
if you're if you are a low-income New Yorker,
most Americans hope to achieve that kind of wealth. I mean, it's one of the arguments actually that they're used.
Think about it. If you earn $20,000 a year and you're struggling to get by, and the federal government is taking 10% of your paycheck in taxes. If you got $200 or $400 or $500 back, you would be likely to spend that right away on clothes for your children, on health care, on some basic need that you have. That low-income New Yorker is much likely to spend it right away and stimulate the economy than a millionaire.
One final sort of question along these lines. What does this do to our deficits? I mean, I was, it seems only yesterday, then the major concern of virtually every economist, both on the left and the right, was we had to reduce the American deficit. What is this going to do?
Well, in fact, the federal deficit for this year will be in excess of $400 billion. $400 billion. That's much more than it's been in any previous year, and I don't think the President has laid out a plan that will close that deficit. Of course, the challenge for us as advocates for low-income New Yorkers is that it means that the President and folks in Washington are likely to take that money away from programs that support low-income New Yorkers, from education, from health care, from housing. That's what we have to worry about.
David Harris, let's start talking about another part of this and something that seemed to have gotten left out, and that's the child tax credits. First of all, explain what your organization does in regard to this, and give our viewers some understanding of how this would work or isn't working.
Our organization basically advocates on behalf of children and families, especially low-income children and families, to make sure that they have a fair shot, just like the rest of America. And what was done in the 2003 tax cut that just passed, the $350 billion tax cut, as well as the 2001 $1.3 trillion tax cut, was that the child tax credit, which people were talking about, was used as a Trojan horse, in a sense, to get these other cuts through. It allowed these averages to be talked about, and about families getting an additional $400 for each kid they have.
And how does this work? I have a 4-year-old. What would happen as I filed my federal taxes?
If you're a middle-class family and you have a 4-year-old, you would get $400 back for each child that you have. You actually get a check this summer, in late July or early August, $400 for each kid that you have. Be a big deal for you. The story was that it was going to go to all families. It turns out that there are 20 million children at the bottom left out, over a quarter of all children, including half of all African American children, over 40% of Latino children, who are left out of the full credit. There was one small provision in there that cost 1% of the overall bill that would have helped 12 million of these children. All these kids are in working families, and at the last minute that was cut out, even though it only cost 1%. Different stories went around about how there wasn't room in the tax cut for it because they had to make room for tax cuts for the most wealthy. But the fact of the matter is it wasn't a priority of the leadership who pushed this bill through. There have since been efforts. Not everyone was sure about it being cut out. Literally, these children were left out in a footnote. Since then, there have been efforts to restore it, and the Senate has passed a bill to restore it, but it's being held up by the House leadership, who claim that these people, that this would be welfare, despite the fact that each and every one of these families has earnings above $10,500.
And they're not on TANF.
Not on welfare at all, not on TANF
But
at
they're
all.
saying for this kind of relief, interesting. And how do they justify that? What is the reasoning here?
Well, their justification, unfortunately, is not working, because if you look at these families, primarily with earnings between $10,500 and $26,000, $27,000, all of them are working. $10,300 is full-time, full-year minimum wage.
Right.
So if you're a sole breadwinner who's working the minimum wage, playing by the rules, you still get nothing. We're not even talking about helping those people, which we should be doing. So this is only people above that. You're talking about the men and women who are currently in Iraq, and we're in Iraq and Afghanistan, who are service members, fighting over there, ineligible. The Senate tried to fix this since then, and the House didn't even include that provision. So you're talking about home health care attendants, teachers' assistants. These are pro-work, pro-marriage, good incentives, and would help working families who'd spend as David said, they would spend these dollars in their communities in New York City immediately.
I guess coming in New York, is there any sense of outrage growing on these issues? We don't see it, obviously, in some of the mainstream press. I mean, you hear about it. I think the last thing that came out relatively recently was looking at, in New York City, the top 400 earners or something getting a unique windfall. But what is your sense of the popular sentiment across the nation on some of this stuff?
I think that the administration has done a masterful job to conceal what's really going on. And the fact of the matter is these families were left out and they should have been included. And if the administration wanted to include them, or anyone wanted to include them, they could have been included for a very, very, very small additional price. And they hid that. But it came out on the front page of the New York Times the day after the bill was signed. And since then, there's been a fair amount of coverage around the country. I mean, it's been close to 1 month of coverage on this issue, not just in the leading papers, but in editorials around the country and in articles around the country. And right now, as the president travels around raising money, there are strollers outside, people with strollers outside talking about this issue. And so I don't think that this issue is going to go away.
Mm-hmm. And has the White House responded directly to this issue?
The White House at first claimed that the president would sign any bill, and he wanted to get it done. And this wasn't in there, and he signed the bill to get it done. After the Senate passed 94-2, overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, the White House came out and said they wanted to get the bill done and that they would sign a bill. But since then, the House has come out with a very, very different, much larger bill. It's an $82 billion bill to solve a $3.5 billion problem that gives us huge deficits and adds people at the top, wealthier families, added on with these low-income families who need the support. And so there's no, currently there's no compromise. And what we need is, and what we hope for, is that the administration will step in if they really believe something should get done and don't just believe they should talk about it, that they will step in and help solve this.
David, do you see any other issues of equity that are developing in the tax proposals that the President has proposed?
Well, I would say something on the child tax credit related to what this David had to say, and that is the tax cut strategy is a stealth strategy. It is really hidden. Its implications are really hidden to most New Yorkers. But it seemed as if the administration was exposed on the child tax credit. And when the House of Representatives adds an additional $80 billion into the tax cut bill, you began our discussion by saying, is it class warfare? You have to worry when we're trying to add $3 billion to help low-income Americans, low-income New Yorkers, and the House says we need $80 billion more to help upper-income Americans and New Yorkers. The challenge for us is that tax cuts are about numbers, right? People don't always hear that tax cuts, in fact, have an impact on the government, what the government's able to do. So we have to worry about if there are fewer dollars that the federal government collects, are we going to have the services that low-income and middle-income New Yorkers need in order for an adequate quality of life here in the city?
It's also a failure, I think, of perhaps progressives, perhaps of other parties. Tax cuts sounds good if you're sitting there. I mean, people rarely go beyond it. You know, I've had it. I mean, all this money goes out, they take it out of my paycheck, and when someone comes along and says, yeah, I'm going to cut your taxes, getting to the details, and obviously here the devil is literally in the details, is very difficult. And I think clearly our side of the argument is still falling behind in convincing large parts of the electorate that this is not fair, that there's inequity that's developed here, because they just hear the first words, tax cuts, yeah. This can give me enough money so I don't have to deal with this enormous IRS bill that keeps hitting me. And I think clearly that's going to be part of our problem going forward.
I think there are two things that you have to worry about with tax cuts. The first is it going to the right people? And there are 8 million, forgetting the child tax credit, there are 8 million Americans, low-income Americans generally, who don't get any tax cut. The second issue is what happens when those revenues are taken out of the federal budget. We've started to talk about that, and I think you have to worry about both of those things when you talk about tax cuts.
Okay. Thank you. We'll be right back to continue the urban agenda.
Parents, come here. Come a little closer. Are your kids getting enough art? Arts education programs are being cut, making it hard for kids today. The arts can help your kids read, write, and express themselves better. Drama, music, and dance can build self-confidence. So get your kids involved in the arts and see how much fun it can be. Trust me.
Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
We're talking with David Harris, president of the Children's Research and Education Institute, and my CSS colleague, David Campbell, the vice president of programs. David Harris, let's take it home. I mean, we're basically a New York audience.
Yes.
What's the impact if we can get these child tax credits restored for New Yorkers?
It's huge. I mean, to start off, there's over 500,000 children in New York who are entirely left out of this increase. If this increase were to pass, you'd talk about 250,000 kids getting support. Now, there'd still be 250,000 who are left out, and we need to do something about that. But 250,000 children. And right now, as I said earlier, if you're African American, if you're Latino, you basically have a 1 in 2 shot. So you walk around your neighborhood and you look, you say, you get it, you don't. You get it, you don't. It's one of the reasons why we've had leadership in our state, certainly starting with Congressman Rangel, who's been terrific on this issue because he understands it so well,
right,
as well as others. But you know, the issue, it's not just a Democratic issue, it's a bipartisan issue. We had Senator Warner, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Senator John McCain, Olympia Snowe from Maine, coming forward concerned about the men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting over there with the kids here left out.
And it would be pretty tangible. I mean, if for a family, if you have 2 kids, that's $800 that would come, enough for, that's a lot of money.
It's on average, it's going to be less than that, unfortunately.
Really?
They still don't get the full deal. But if they were to get it, it would be on average $150 per child. So if you're talking about the average family
Right.
that's got 2 kids, you're talking about a check for about $300 this year, next year.
Enough to obviously do a month's shopping or a
Quite
couple of weeks
significant
shopping.
for some groceries.
I'm showing my age. It
Right.
used to be a month's shopping. Now, clearly you can't do that anymore.
Significant groceries, clothes for the start of school. What we're hoping is if this gets done in time to get school supplies for kids. Kids go back to school in September. These other families will get those checks this summer. And if these families that we're talking about right now are left out, they're not going to get the checks in time to get their supplies for school.
And clearly that goes right out the door, knowing how you're doing it, particularly with little kids.
Yeah.
That immediately goes out. It's true. That's going to work that way.
mean,
Now, there's some talk that there are unforeseen problems with the tax cut sort of hitting in New Yorkers in an unusual way. I mean, okay, we take this $350 billion tax cut. That should be it for New York. But it isn't, apparently.
Well,
David Campbell.
there are a couple of other issues. The first is that aspects of the tax cut of the federal tax cut are tied to the way in which states collect their tax revenue. In New York State, in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, the tri-state area, if you look at the tax cut over 10 years, it means $1 billion in fewer revenues will be collected by New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. This hasn't been a good year for budgets in New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut. And we know what that $1 billion could mean. This year we had to worry about whether there are cuts in Medicaid, cuts in education, cuts in child care. And so the taking away of that $1 billion of revenue has serious long-term consequences for New York State.
Well, let's talk about it. We've talked basically about the tax cut, the fairness of the tax cut. But obviously taking this much money out of the federal budget has its implications in terms of services that the federal government can still provide. Let's talk about some of those problems that we see, particularly for poor and working poor New Yorkers.
Well, think about what we faced in New York State this year. We faced a $12 billion deficit, and the governor proposed a series of very serious cuts in education, health care for the poor, housing, and a cross-section of areas. And where could the state look for money? It couldn't look to the federal government for money because the federal government was proposing a huge tax cut. Part of that tax cut was also related to a proposal that would cut Medicaid at the federal level, and that would mean fewer resources for New York State for health care for the poor. The challenge is that if there are fewer dollars at the federal level, there'll be fewer dollars for programs at the state level that affect low-income New Yorkers.
Well, we're also confronted, I mean, obviously part of the reason the president was able to deliver all this was a successful war in Iraq, but there was a price tag put on the Iraq war that really was based apparently on some faulty assumptions that this was going to be a process of democratization that was going to be relatively clean-cut and efficient. Apparently it doesn't seem to be working that way. Has anyone started to look into the fact that if America has to keep troops in for much longer than expected, what that's going to be in terms of drawing money away from the rest of the economy? Critical things, whether that's for the poor or, for whatever. Has there been any analysis that you've heard about in terms of that?
Well, I think the question you have to ask is this the right time to be giving $93,000 a year to millionaires in the United States? If we need to fight to do democratization in Iraq, if we have a $400 billion federal deficit, is this the right time to be giving such a huge tax cut to upper income Americans? How will we get the money to continue to provide for children's health insurance? How will we get the money to continue to provide for Section 8 vouchers for housing in New York City? I don't know.
Well, given the last visit by President Bush for a fundraiser, obviously somebody's happy. He got $4 million at one event. Clearly not only because they got a tax cut, but clearly there are things, certain people are very happy, and obviously they don't feel any particular qualms about going forward with this.
But think about what our experience has been in New York City and New York State in the past year. New York City has had to cut back in so many areas. Yes, the president's approval ratings may be high because people feel they're getting upper income people getting money in their pocket. But what is quality of life like in New York City? What have we lost in the past year? We have to worry about that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about New York State and the city. While there hasn't been a tax cut, it was actually, I think the governor had proposed it, but it didn't go through. There is a sense that the cost of everything is going through the roof in New York. And let's talk about the relationship. There have been sort of added fees that have come to everybody. Property tax, obviously, is first in everyone's mind, with the 18 actually to 23% increase in property tax, which is unprecedented. But there's also things going on across the state now.
In all but 5 of the counties in New York State, there have been property tax increases this year. That's because there have been increases in state costs that haven't been covered by the federal government that counties are responsible for. That means that if states have to, that counties have to increase their property taxes to cover these state costs, they're not going to have enough money for basic services at the county level, not different than what we experience in New York City. The basic services that the city helps to support, affordable child care, health clinics, recycling even, those things that contribute to the quality of life. On average, in New York State, counties have had to increase their property taxes 20 and 25%. If you're a homeowner that owns a house or an apartment worth $100,000, where are you going to come up with the extra money to pay for those property taxes? It's not going to come from the tax cut, because the tax cut was going to go to people who own those $800,000 or $1 million properties.
David Harris, you have a sort of national perspective of what's happening, but particularly in areas of child support and the rest, what else is getting missed here?
Well, here's my real concern. I mean, this is not a theoretical, I know you know
Right.
this is not a theoretical conversation. Before I went into the advocacy work that I do now, I taught pre-K and kindergarten in this state in the public schools
Right.
on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. My job was they were talking about getting rid of my job, not for me, but all of pre-K funding earlier this year. They were talking about making kindergarten a half day. And that's bad for children, because we know how important it is for kids to be there. It's terrible for working parents, because how can you go to work if your kid doesn't have a place to be during the school day? And then the kids arrive in kindergarten or first grade, not right. That's at risk right now. It's not going to happen next year, but we have these cuts at the federal level and cuts at the local level. That's at risk, and we're quite concerned.
Okay, we've painted this pretty grim picture of service cuts and incredible tax benefits for the very wealthy. I have a cartoon from Nast, who used to do Boss Tweed, who was the boss of in the bad times in the 1890s, which shows essentially liberty being clawed by the Tammany tiger, which was the icon for the corrupt machine of the time. And under it says, "So what are you going to do about it? We've got a problem we know about. What do you suggest that we do to try to roll some of these things back?" I don't want to leave this, our viewers or anybody with just the bleak picture here. I mean, obviously New York has some reserves. People can do things. What would you suggest? How are you suggesting people mobilize on this kind of thing, David?
It's an excellent question. There are a lot of people mobilizing on these issues already. First and foremost is that people need to get registered to vote. It really matters who's in office and who's advocating for them. And to get to the polls. I know that's a long time away, but
Right.
Who's in office, they have different priorities. Second is to contact their representatives, state, local, federal representatives, and let them know that they care about these issues and that they're concerned about them.
Yeah, and I also think we're finding, and perhaps everyone should find, that this is a bipartisan issue.
Yes.
I don't think people remember, and perhaps it shows my age, where the Republicans had always been the ones that hated deficits more than anybody else. It's only recently that deficits have suddenly become acceptable to the sort of mainstream Republican Party. And I still think you find large members of the House and Senate who are concerned with ballooning deficits, and actually they were the ones who led the charge to limit the president's tax cut. So I don't think this is a foregone conclusion on ideological lines either.
Oh, not at all.
And I think that's what we start to forget sometimes, that there's Republican support for restraining these kinds of extraordinary tax cuts as well as more equity. But what do you think, David? How do you go about challenging some of these things? You're sitting there, you've just heard this program. It's not much fun. What do you do about this to try to preserve your family and your communities?
Well, the first question I would ask is, David Harris told us that, that the child tax credit was left out of the final bill. I forget the exact phrase that you used, but it was just sort of a simple omission. But how can you omit $3 million or a $3 billion child tax credit for low-income people? Why can people do that? Because they think low-income New Yorkers don't care. They think that low-income New Yorkers don't vote, and they think that low-income New Yorkers won't notice. What David Harris said is absolutely right. People have to vote, and people have to register to vote, people have to vote, and people have to call their members of Congress and let them know what they think, that they can't be ignored.
My thanks to David Harris of the Children's Research and Education Institute and David Campbell, Vice President of Programs at CSS. Today, funding for education and healthcare is being slashed, along with many other programs that are critical for poor and working poor families. Yet the federal and state governments continue to pursue strategies that call for billions of dollars of tax cuts for the wealthy. This is an ill-conceived vision of the America we need to be rebuilding, and it does indeed sound like 21st century class warfare, and that should worry us all. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for watching the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.